Alright, here we go. Female reproductive anatomy. One of the things that you will see in this next video is how there are tissues that are different structures, that make different structures in male and female reproductive systems, but the actual tissues themselves are the same. And so developmentally, in the very beginning, we all have the same tissues, but depending on which hormones we're getting, those tissues are going to develop obviously very differently and function very differently. But it's cool kind of to think of how we all start off with the same exact tissues for both male and female reproductive systems, just like we all start off with the same tissues as each other for cardio, respiratory, integumentary, and all the rest that we've talked about. And so, as we talked about in the male reproductive system, there is a follicle-stimulating hormone. This is where that hormone gets its name, really, is because it's going to stimulate follicles. No surprise, right? And the follicles are going to help nurture the eggs and also produce the sex hormones. And so, let's take a look at our perfect view, right? The female and our male, both in these awkward laying down poses. I'm not going to play the animation for you, but just thought I'd share with you that wonderful picture. Just because. Alright, so here are the parts that we'll get into. Uterine tube, fallopian tube, I believe your book may even say oviduct, is where the egg, it's the tube where the egg comes from the ovary to the uterus. Pretty simple. And then the uterus opens into the vagina, which has there are three layers to the uterine wall, which you probably already would recognize these, because endo is the inner, peri is the outside, like we saw in periosteum. Myometrium is the thick muscular layer, just like the myocardium is the thick muscular layer of the heart. So you should recognize all these words already without even really knowing what they are. There it is, the vagina. Not as common, right, for middle schoolers and maybe even freshmen or sophomores if you're still in that mode. You're not going to draw that. But pretty simple, right? Receives the penis and also forms the birth canal. And there is actually the same view that you'll see on the test. Side view for males and front view for females for reproductive anatomy pictures that you will be labeling. As you'll see in a little bit, the side view of the female is nothing like what you see in the front view, and so it might be a little too confusing just because it's so cool. There's an egg cell developing in the ovary, or maybe developed and being released. Just because, right, there's like the picture of life, all of our existence. Right. External anatomy for both male and female are not as important as far as function goes. We'll have muscles, but not to focus on them. Protective labia majora and labia minora are just folds that are external protection. We're talking about we're talking about a system that is so rarely actually useful, but the things that are in place to make sure that time that they are useful are correct, protected, chemistry is right, everything is perfect, so that our species can exist, which is kind of a cool thing. One thing I will point out on this slide too that I think is interesting is where the corresponding male tissues come in, and they are literally the exact same developmentally, the exact same tissues that just take a completely different form, right, when they get different hormones, which again I think is just one of the cool things about mammal development that you would really never consider unless you were learning about it. Again, side view, so it doesn't look anywhere like anything like the front view, but so not a view that you'll see, but I guess if you wanted to compare the male and female tissues, this would be a good place to do it because you have the exact same picture for a male. Again, I just think it's interesting the comparison and the correspondence between the tissues of the two reproductive systems between different genders. We talked briefly about sperm formation. Here's the egg formation. Again, on the off chance that these gametes are actually used, we need to talk about the process just very briefly. I'm not going to go into a lot of the biology. This word is oogenesis. I know it doesn't look like it, but that's just a weird, probably Latin translation that just makes it look differently than it's pronounced. So those are the primary and secondary oocytes, which I will point out that here is where the female and male gamete production and meiosis even is different, because what we'll see is over here on the right, the development of, or the maturation, the gamete production from a germ cell, GERM, into what will eventually become an egg. It's often heard, you often hear this, maybe people talking about how females are born with all of the eggs that they will have for their lives. It's not entirely true. This is not an egg right here. It's a germ cell. It's a diploid cell that will become an egg. The eggs still have to go through meiosis to form, and that's our monthly cycle that we'll talk about for females. But females are born with all the germ cells that they will have, but not necessarily all the eggs, and that's just something that sometimes you'll hear, and I guess it's just a matter of words, but technically not true. So there's that primary oocyte, which is going to go through a division. However, the division isn't exactly the same as males. Very different, I guess you could say, because that division here is, I guess here, first into secondary oocyte, which contains the correct number of chromosomes, and everything else is right. The other cell is not really a cell. It's called a polar body that will be basically disintegrated and recycled, perhaps for use next month. That secondary oocyte, which again is fully functional, the chromosomes and everything are correct, will develop into an egg, mature egg, and when it divides, that other cell that it could have become is just a polar body, again just gets recycled. We saw in the male spermatogenesis where that one cell, germ cell, becomes 4 haploid sex cells. They actually become 4 sperm. But for females, we just have a 1-to-1, essentially 1-to-1 ratio from germ to mature egg. Oops. Sorry. What do we have? Oh, here's the comparison of the two meiosises, I guess. How they're alike, but mostly how they're different. And so that's, again, something I just mentioned. Here's the monthly cycle and the trigger from the hypothalamus and the gonadotropins. Again, same exact gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, just obviously what they're doing, where they're coming from, and even where they're going is essentially the same part. Functionally, there's a big difference between the testes and the ovaries, but structurally, there's not, developmentally, certainly not a difference at all. But here we have all the hormones, where they're coming from, and what their jobs are, which again is just something that you want to make sure you remember. The hormone control, and so here's where, again, where the female system branches off quite a bit, is because of hormone control. Extremely different from males. And so here's the follicle after it becomes the corpus luteum, which is just essentially going to just get recycled as well. That's where the sex hormones are being secreted, and then actually I'll just show you those things in the graph on the future slide, so hang on to that thought. But here's our wonderful picture again of the female parts that you have on page 499 that you just saw in the male reproductive anatomy, a diagram that showed hypothalamus and anterior pituitary hormones, as well as testes, sex hormones. Essentially, if you take out the male parts and replace them with female parts, and take out the male hormones and replace them with female hormones, we all have estrogen, we all have testosterone, just the levels are extremely different. But essentially that last diagram, if you just switch things around, it's essentially the same exact diagram, just be for a female. Here's another, this should probably be reversed, if the egg is fertilized versus if it is not fertilized, because again, I go back to this idea that the number of times that an egg is fertilized versus not fertilized is such an extreme number for the whole entire system really to be truly useful or not. So if the egg is fertilized, which thank you again, women, for helping to maintain the existence of our species and all of that things that your hormones are doing for us. There it is. If the egg is fertilized, the embryo will release some hormones that maintain the uterine lining, and menstruation does not occur, so the cycle shuts down. We'll get into the details of which, but basically the hormones that were doing all of the menstrual cycle stuff are either shut off or going somewhere else to do something else. Because now, instead of creating an egg and maturing that egg, developing that egg, it's going to go into now the fertilization process, so developing an embryo, which is extremely different. But for most eggs, they don't get fertilized. And so here's what happens to them. There's a drop in the luteinizing hormone, which is going to shut down the corpus luteum. It's going to trigger menstruation to kind of pick back up again after one cycle completes, and the hypothalamus and pituitary will start the creation of the new follicle through the gonadotropins and gonadotropin releasing hormone. Here's a graph that you have, or partially a graph. I couldn't get it onto 4 different slides, but this is the top part of a graph that you have very similarly in your book on page 508. But essentially it shows you all the hormones and what they're doing in terms of the exact same 28-day cycle. So there's the gonadotropins and their job right there. And when their levels are highest, we're going to say just about 14 days when ovulation takes place. And then here are the sex hormones, which are going to increase at about the same time and start the thickening of the endometrium. Again, on the off chance that that thick endometrium is useful for a fertilized egg to implant and be nourished by. It's incredible the amount of work that goes into this, and girls, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but the amount of work that goes into the off chance, but we are all the result of an off chance, and I think that's so super cool that we exist because of these systems just happening to work at the right time, all the time, but happening to go into effect at the right time. And then menopause is obviously the time where things basically stop. The menstrual cycle stops because of a drop or a complete loss of hormones, and that's it. The mammary glands are in both males and females, but don't get the hormones, don't get the signals to develop in males like they do in females. And another, I think, really cool thing that makes, again, the female reproductive system even more unique and cool is that there's the stimulation of the development of the mammary glands, but also after childbirth, those mammary glands really get activated. After childbirth, prolactin, which is a protein that's going to prohibit milk production, is no longer prohibited. So after a child is born, again, it's all hormones, just completely different. that protein is no longer prohibiting their milk production. So again, just on the off chance that all this works out, that there is a little tiny human in there, and I have two perfect examples of tiny humans that have been made because of all this, which is again maybe why I think it's extra cool. So again, there's just the mammary gland section, and that's the picture that you don't have to know, but we're talking about it. So there are the glands and all the parts, including more parts than you'll probably ever go over. That is the end of our second video. We'll have a brief video following this one.